Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Kim Rubin, Saul Price Fellow of the Tax Policy Center and Director of the State and Local Finance Initiative at the Urban Institute. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here today to be part of a conversation about the challenges facing our country's cities. This is part of a series of events we're hosting, examining the fiscal pressures on different levels of state and local governments in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. We had early events focused on states and school districts, and next month we'll turn our attention to counties and the pressures they're facing, especially the challenges related to running the upcoming election. But today we are looking at cities. The last 6 months have been challenging for city leaders, needing to respond to the onset of COVID-19 pandemic and both the public health and economic fallout. This includes the timing of closing and reopening businesses and restricting activities of their residents, often while receiving conflicting information or mandates from federal and state officials. Cities have also been the focus of growing protests and calls for police reform in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's death. And they had already been trying to address the focus of growing protests. Many cities were already taking on equity challenges related to housing affordability, homelessness, and unequal access to jobs, while considering what policies could help them thrive in a way that benefits all residents. And while these efforts are now more important than ever, they need to be undertaken when cities are facing a lack of revenues and facing changing economic conditions and limited direct assistance from the federal government. We have an excellent panel here today to discuss these questions, but first, some housekeeping. This virtual event is being recorded and will be posted online after it's over. Biographies and the slides will be available online, and all participants are muted. Type questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll be reviewing and leaving time at the end for panelists to respond. We encourage everyone in the audience to continue today's dialogue by sharing your thoughts and observations on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Our panel will be moderated by Tracy Gordon, Senior Fellow at the Tax Policy Center, who will introduce the other panelists. Tracy.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks everyone for being here today. I just want to start by saying that we're about to hear some very good economic news. After record-breaking declines in economic activity in the second quarter of 2020, we are going to see eye-popping consensus forecasts say 25% growth in the third quarter. So we should not lose sight of what that means for people who are still struggling, businesses who are still struggling, and the fact that we still have a very deep hole to climb out of. Much has been written about the so-called K-shaped recovery, and especially workers at the low end of the income distribution who don't have options to work from home and for whom federal help is already fading away. Less has been said about what this means for cities. And as we see hollowed out downtowns with fewer workers coming in, buying lattes, what one economist has called any service that depends on a smile, what does that mean for city revenues? One estimate suggests that, especially in high rent zip codes, high rent districts, employment still is at 45% of pre-COVID levels. So we're about to explore these things today. We also have a blog, my colleagues, Richard Oksher, Ervin Bodapalli, and I have a blog looking at what this means for cities and looking at how it really depends on pre-existing revenue structure, each city's industry mix, and of course their exposure to COVID, as well as the highly uncertain federal and state policy response. So if I could get to the next slide, please. Uh-oh. There we go. So the point of our blog is really that going into this, there were a lot of things that we thought we knew about city economies and finances. And much of that has been upended by COVID. For example, as I said, it used to be thought to be a success story if you were a service economy. Now many of those jobs are under threat. Similarly, we used to think that cities that had successfully evaded the property tax revolt by diversifying their revenue sources into things like charges and fees for services or little tiny taxes like hotel occupancy taxes, which are even better from a certain point of view because you are basically having tourists pay those taxes and not your residents. We used to think of those cities as the winners, as well as cities that had access to more revenue streams thanks to laws that their states had put on the books. So access to things like the personal income tax or sales and use taxes. But now we see that those revenues are vulnerable just like they are at the state level. So this is from our blog today that basically shows for most cities, sales and income taxes are not a big chunk of their revenues. But if you add up all of these fees and charges and little tiny taxes, other taxes, that accounts for about 40% of revenues, especially in big cities. And of course, there's a lot of variation. You know, there's the saying that if you've seen one city, then you've seen one city. So we're very lucky to have a panel here today that can represent that diversity of experiences in many different types of cities. So I'll now introduce our panelists. We have Mayor Andy Berke from Chattanooga, Tennessee. He is a former two-term state senator, so he can also speak to the perspective of the state. I think he was actually a state senator during the Great Recession, so he may have some insights on that experience. And he's won numerous awards, which I won't go into here. Various groups have named him Legislator of the Year, Friend of Education, Municipal Leader of the Year, and he holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School and a bachelor's degree from Stanford. Carolyn Coleman has more than 25 years of experience as a leader and advocate in the public and private sectors. She's now the executive director of the League of California Cities. She also spent a decade with the National League of Cities here in Washington, D.C., so she can speak to the national perspective, where she was director of federal advocacy. She was a deputy mayor of the city of Indianapolis, where she focused on affordable housing, economic development, infrastructure, and community engagement initiatives. And she's on many boards of directors, including the McGeorge School of Law and the University of Indianapolis. Mayor Michael Nutter is a former two-term mayor of Philadelphia with almost 15 years of experience as well on the city council. He's the inaugural David Dinkins Professor of the Practice in Urban and Public Affairs at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He also is a senior fellow and national spokesperson for the What Works Cities program at Bluebird Philanthropies and a member of the External Advisory Board for JP Morgan Chase's Advancing Cities Initiative. He's past president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and also serves on various boards, including the Urban Institute. So welcome to you all. Thanks so much for being here. I was going to start with you, Carolyn, since the League of California Cities published a report summarizing the experiences of cities in California, and I know that you're well-versed in all of the information coming out of the National League of Cities. Can you give us sort of a bird's eye view of what's happening for cities, both at the state and the national level?
I'm happy to do that, Tracy. And first, I want to thank you for putting together this conversation, and also to thank the Urban Institute for this important conversation. It's always good for me to spend time with two of my favorite mayors, albeit one's outside of California. So good to be here with both of you. What I thought I'd do is just try to do a little bit of a level set, a little bit about what's happening fiscally in California cities, as well as part of the national view, thanks to the National League of Cities. So let's go back to January 2020. City revenues were finally returning to the pre-Great Recession levels, with reserves and revenues trending positive. We weren't out of the woods, but things were looking up. Very quickly, 2 months later, in March 2020, as COVID-19 took hold, the U.S. economy went into a free fall, and at the local level, we began to close down our local economies to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The impact was swift. We had to close businesses, retail sales plummeted, unemployment skyrocketed, and uncertainty was the name of the day. The fiscal impact of these swift changes were felt immediately on city budgets. Sales and income tax revenues were the first to be hit, and cities that rely on those sources were forced to take immediate action as the shortfalls began. In some cities, even property tax revenues started to show signs of weakening as the economic hardships began to dampen demand for real estate. It's not quite the case in California, but certainly in other cities. I do want to just point out that given that most cities' fiscal year 20 budget captures only a few months of the pandemic recession, it is the fiscal 21 year budgets, which for most cities started July 1, that were more fully feel and capture the fiscal impacts felt by cities across the country. And at some point, I truly do believe that when we look back, the toll of this pandemic on our economies could easily be more severe than that which we experienced during the Great Recession. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. If you look at this first slide, which is from the National League of Cities 2020 Fiscal Conditions Survey, the next slide, you will see the breadth and depth of the challenges facing city budgets. According to city fiscal officers from across the country, nearly 90% of cities will be less able in fiscal year 21 than in 2020 to meet the needs of their communities. In fact, our current estimates for 2020 put a year-over-year general revenue fund growth at near zero. It's been a long time since we've been at zero. On average, you'll see in the next slide, cities anticipate a 13% decline in fiscal year 21 general fund revenues over what they had in 2020. But unlike the Great Recession, the impact on city budgets of COVID were immediate and deep. This is not something that was gradual, that played out over about 18 months or so, which is what we experienced with the Great Recession. Now I want to take a look at a little more specifically about what happened in California. By April 2020, so we're just 4 months into the year, California cities were facing a $7 billion revenue shortfall in their general fund revenues due to COVID-19. You look at the next slide, you can see that the impact of COVID-19, while it's being felt across all of the revenue streams that Tracy highlighted earlier, it's being felt most acutely in our sales taxes and not surprisingly in our hotel bed taxes. In a state that is known for its recreational activities and tourism, sales and these transient occupancy taxes are key to local government's revenue streams, and those have been severely hit. Now, for cities, these revenues fund essential, what I like to call bread and butter services in our communities. There's services like police and fire, code enforcement, street maintenance, filling potholes. They also fund millions of public sector jobs, and it is those jobs which are vital to a strong middle class in our country. If you'll look at the next slide, you'll see that these revenue shortfalls in California, and I'm sure that my colleagues from across the country in every state have put together these kinds of numbers, and certainly the National League of Cities has done it as well. These shortfalls will have real consequences. With states facing their own budget challenges and the federal government so far providing only minimal relief to cities, we are having to go it alone. But with balanced budget requirements and revenue-raising restrictions, cities are going to have no choice but to cut services, lay off workers, freeze hiring, and roll back capital projects, which is the very investment we need in our communities. As we begin to look beyond 2020, cities continue and will continue to face economic and fiscal uncertainty. Tracy, I hope some of the good news you shared a few minutes ago does come to fruition, because our cities are going to be focused on trying to keep their communities safe from a surge in COVID-19 and whatever happens with the flu, but we're also going to be trying to reopen our local economies and to do so in a very safe fashion. I think it is precisely times like these where cities need the federal government to step up and provide assistance. It's the smart thing to do, and it's the right thing to do.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was just perfect in terms of the overview. I'd love to turn to Mayor Berke now and hear about what's happening on the ground in your city. I know that you just enacted a budget that included many of the solutions that Carolyn mentioned, hiring freezes, stalled projects. What more could you say about that?
Yes, and thanks again to the Urban Institute and to you, Tracy. And it is a pleasure to be on with Carolyn, who I've gotten to know over the years. And then Mayor Nutter is someone who not only do I admire, but I know every mayor around the country is a Mayor Nutter fan. So great to be on a panel with him, and appreciate y'all. Let me put a face to some of the things that Carolyn is talking about. And to make it more explicit, let's try to back up and say a little bit about Chattanooga. So Chattanooga is solidly a mid-sized city. We're about 180,000 person city in a county that is 375,000 in a metro that is 575,000. We're squarely the center of that donut. And so we have all the things going on that mid-sized cities have, but we also have been doing a little bit better than most. We've been a bit of an it city at the beginning of the year. Forbes magazine said that Chattanooga would be the #1 city for job growth in the country. I say that to brag, of course. Mayor Nutter knows that. Every mayor has to, you get paid per brag, I think. So we've got to brag, but also to say that we were fundamentally in a strong position when we entered March of 2020. City government had built up our reserves. We had virtually twice the reserves going into March of 2020 that we had going into 2009. And lots of things were going right. We had a bit of an it vibe going on. And all of a sudden, COVID hits and things change immediately. We see it in small businesses that don't have 60 days of cash reserve. We see it in our hospitality industry, which had been going like gangbusters, hotels going up everywhere. All of a sudden, rooms start to decline. We see it, of course, in city coffers because Tennessee has 0 income tax. It's against our Constitution. We have sales tax and we have hotel motel tax are our 2 main sources of revenue, apart from the dollars that we get from other governmental sources like state and federal. And all of a sudden that just started to vanish. And so as we hit the budget, this budget that we had started to put together, and we're on a July 1 fiscal year. So we had been anticipating putting together this really robust initiative that expanded the services that we were giving to people, and also huge capital projects. That went away, and instead we were dealing with setting aside money for small businesses to help them survive and ride out the pandemic of closures. We are setting aside money for enhanced service for people in our community to beef up immediate response to homelessness, which of course, no matter what you're talking about with eviction and those have gone away, you see increased homelessness in a world of 10% unemployment. All those things took precedent. At the same time, and then I'll turn it back to you, Tracy, I want to give people an idea of what it looks like in real world when you enact these freezes, because it's one thing to say it's a freeze and everybody says, okay, well, that's fine. And we were lucky we didn't lay off or furlough anybody. But the real world consequence is we freeze our fire department. That means we don't have an academy, which puts us down 30 firefighters. At the same time, we have a global pandemic going on, and another 25 firefighters are out at any given time because they've either been exposed or they've gotten COVID. And so now we're down 55 firefighters. And that's just one of the myriad things that the city government does. And that's the real world impact of not being able to take a really studied approach to how you reduce services, but to just be in an emergency where you just freeze everything and you are where you are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Carolyn, you had mentioned the similarities and differences with the Great Recession. I can't resist plugging an article that Kim and another colleague, Lucy Dedian, and I did that actually showed that your instinct is right. The initial shocks to income and sales taxes at the state and local level combined were worse than the Great Recession because of the abruptness of this pandemic. So I wanted to invite Mayor Nutter to comment on similarities and differences to the last big recession, the one that you might have to rename because apparently it was not so great, or it's not so great anymore compared to this.
Yeah, no, I think it's, thank you, Tracy, and certainly to Urban Institute and my great colleagues, Carolyn and Mayor Berke. A dozen years ago, when we hadn't even figured out that we were in recession yet, summer of 2008, I'm 6 months, 7 months into my first year of my first term, and my chief of staff and finance director said they needed to talk to me. clearly I was a rookie and didn't realize that when your chief of staff and finance director need to talk to you immediately, I should have known to just run and not take that call. That's a call you don't want. There's no good news coming out of that call. But I didn't know, so we met. And they said, well, this is now, again, the summer of 2008. We're not exactly sure what's going on, but we're seeing some unusual signs of lack of revenue, lack of collections. But we'll monitor it, and maybe it's just a blip or an anomaly or something. So best of luck. I got that call again in August. Still hadn't learned the fundamental lesson of not taking that call or meeting, but nonetheless, I'm a little slow on the uptake. And they said, well, there's definitely something going on. We have a problem, and we're actually starting to run out of money. And I said, well, we just passed a budget in May that was balanced. We made investments. We spent some money. I mean, we weren't frivolous, but we spent some money. And finally, in September, the federal government announced that the economy had gone into recession actually back in December of 2007. And so it was a bit of a glide, if you will, into it. And it just continued, as Caroline said, for some time. You make steps, you plug a hole, another hole would pop open. In this scenario, I came home from New York on the night of March 12th. And on the morning of March 13th, the state announced immediate stay-home orders. And all of us basically, regardless of city, almost anywhere in the country, suddenly the economy started to shut down. People had to stay home, businesses closed. Folks weren't even sure what their job situation was. And so it was immediate in its impact. We talked about, and Carolyn has some slides up, not only is the city government negatively impacted, and of course the state, Philly is a city and county, but also our school district, which heavily relies on property tax to fund the education of our children. And so the city will have its own fiscal challenges and the school district at the same time. And the city and the state are the primary funders of education in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so in 2008-9, we didn't make businesses close. They closed some on their own because of an economic worldwide crisis. This was a health crisis that led to an economic crisis, and we had to close to keep people away from each other to save lives. And so in a bizarre kind of way, this is a self-inflicted massive wound in order to try to save lives and save people. And so it's that much more complicated. And lastly, there's no end date. There's been a slow reopening, but there are many, many businesses, not just in Philadelphia, but across the United States of America that have not reopened. Some, unfortunately, because we've now all been in a house 6 months, 7 months, depending on your calendar, some will never reopen. That's a hit economically, but more in human terms to those individuals. Many cities had not fully recovered from 10, 11, 12 years ago, and now find themselves under even more severe pressure.
I think there's sort of a good news, bad news story in a way that to make you feel better about the self-inflicted damage, at least the research that I've seen suggests that even places that were late to adopt those stay-at-home orders still had a big drop in consumption because people were scared. So it's self-inflicted, and yet, it's also something that you can't undo by taking out the stay-at-home orders. People are going to show up and transact in the marketplace when they're good and ready.
When they feel, right. I think as Dr. Fauci has said, that the virus will ultimately decide what happens here.
Exactly. And I just wonder what this means again about sort of what we think of as a healthy city. Mayor Berke, you had talked about this idea of creating magic moments in Chattanooga, and those were all based on being a center for hospitality. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what you see as your vision of the city going forward? Has it changed, or are you just sort of hoping to ride this out?
Well, we are at the Urban Institute, so we have to use the word density at least a few times. You know, for the first 7 years that I was mayor, I ran around saying the word density everywhere. We got to create density. And if you thought about what's going on in the world around us, we had so much generic that was so easily available to people and so cheap that I would say either unique moments or magical moments was what I would talk about. Is how do we create that? And the answer was density. It's through entertainment and the times that we spend with others, because to me at least, you know, the one thing that that we could create in cities that you couldn't get anywhere else was that experience that this is the only time and the only place that you'll be able to have this experience. And that's what was making sports and music and all those other things, in-person dining, so valuable. Well, 6 months ago, after 7 years, I stopped saying density, 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 and started saying no density, no density, no density anywhere. And that's been a huge change. Even, by the way, as we continue to have these spectacular projects for parks and other transformative urban spaces that, you know, ultimately one of the great things is people will be able to gather in large groups. So, I mean, I do think that we are in a position right now where our personal habits are changing. And I know, at least from my experience, you know, right now, if my wife and I receive an invitation to something and it's a Zoom, you know, webinar type circumstance, you know, we're like, okay, great. We can just sit in our living room and do this and turn off the camera and, you know, not dress up. And that sounds really good. And so we don't do any of these in-person things. I do think that there are limits to this, and that it may be a long time, and I don't expect it to be short. But we will eventually start to find ways when we feel safer. I think a big piece of this is I don't feel safe going into large crowds. I don't feel safe. We have in-person dining open in our state. I don't do it. But there will be a moment where I feel safe again. And I do start to miss those, start to think, oh, this great experience is happening and it feels safe and it feels natural and it feels right. And cities have always come back. They will always come back because there are magical and unique things that happen there that cannot happen anyplace else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to talk more about what it looks like when cities come back. Carolyn, you had said something in one of our earlier conversations about how you really should think of every dollar that a city spends as a service or a job. Can you sort of talk about what a city looks like if it's cut its budget, and what kinds of services businesses and residents should be expecting when cities do start to come out of this?
Yeah, boy, I wish we could predict the future a little better there. And I think what Mayor Berke highlights and what Mayor Nutter highlights is there's so much uncertainty around what happens when. I hear people say when we come out of this pandemic or when the pandemic is over. I'm not sure that's the phrase we're going to be using as much as it is. We're going to be living with this, and we're going to adapt how we do that. You know, I often hear folks, when we think about budget cuts in cities, think about it just in terms of a dollar. We just need to balance the budget and cut a dollar here, cut a dollar there. But every dollar that a city spends funds a salary, or it funds a service that community has prioritized as something it needs. I'm sure both of these mayors can give you many stories about constituents, the meetings they've been in, and the need for more police service, the need for better trash pickup. Somebody always needs a pothole filled in a community. So when we take away a dollar, we take away the person or the contractor who actually delivers that service. I think really important to keep in mind when we take away the dollar and it takes away the public safety, the public service job. Those are the folks who are at the heart of our communities. I talk a lot about the local government workforce, which is probably in the 50 millions across this country. And so losing those jobs, and at this point we've lost over 1 million of them, that's real. And it goes to the heart of the people who are living in our communities and providing those services day to day. So it's not just about the dollar, but there are people behind the dollar, and there are services, particularly during this pandemic. I'm sitting out here in the middle of a state that has wildfires, over 28 of them going on at this moment in time. Those dollars fund the people who are keeping us safe. And we can't have it both ways. We can't just slash city budgets and expect fires to be put out and to expect there to be resources to address the pandemic so that we can open our communities safely. We got to do both, and that's why I'll continue to come back to, we need a better partner in the federal government to help us out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that in a second, but I just can't resist asking Mayor Nutter, what did that look like in Philadelphia as the city was coming back with a diminished workforce? Because I know, looking at the data, there are some areas of state and local employment that never came back from the Great Recession, especially sort of non-education jobs that people might have difficulty putting a face to. So do you feel like there were sort of, it costs money to hire someone, to train someone, to get them ready to do the job? What did that look like for you?
Well, there are a couple things. I mean, first of all, I'd made a decision that, and this is not to compare and contrast Philadelphia to any other place because every place is different, but the initial decision was that we would not do massive layoffs. This is a city that was already challenged from an employment standpoint, high poverty rate. Philadelphia, unfortunately, has the highest poverty rate of the 10 largest cities in the United States of America. It's been over 20% for now 40 years, and it is intergenerational and deeply entrenched. We can talk more about that a little later. But also, I did not want to damage the heart and soul of the government, which, there's so many things that you can use technology for, you can mechanize, but there are many, many services where you actually do need people. And so what I was constantly thinking about while we were in the recession was that, one day this will be over. Now, we'd like to think the same thing about COVID-19, but I did actually believe that this part of the Great Recession back at that time would end, and that we had to have the people in place to be able to provide services to even, carry us through the recession and benefit from recovery. But in that moment, you also had to rethink all of the services that you're providing and all of the people who are doing all this work. Do we need to continue to do all of these things? Mm-hmm. Are we the best provider of that service? And as both Carolyn and the mayor said, yes, there is a constituency for every service. Unfortunately, it just doesn't necessarily mean that we should be the provider of it or that we can. Mm-hmm. And so when the team comes to you and says, here are your options, I can assure you that it's a series of all bad options. And what you're trying to figure out is the least worst of those options. How do you protect public safety? How do you look after your most vulnerable population? How do you protect the heart and soul of the government? Someone has to take in the few dollars that are being sent, that people are still paying their taxes. Someone's got to deal with payroll. The employees need to get paid. Debt service, other obligations that you have to pay. Your social services, your prisons, these are mandated obligations that you have. Someone has to provide those services. And so we did shrink the government. We did stop providing some services, but I can assure you, Tracy, that local governments cannot cut their way out of these recessions. We talked about a shared sacrifice. It was half cuts, and we also raised revenue, also known as new taxes. But I would say, and I know you want to get to it, but we also had a great partner in the federal government.
Next question. So if you want to just segue.
7 of my 8 years, I served with President Obama, Vice President Biden's administration. So we had the economic recovery. We had the stimulus. We had Tiger. We had ARA. There were 1 million calls and a coordinated strategy. National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National Association of Counties, all of us trying to figure out and working in partnership. How many calls, Carolyn knows this, and the mayor may as well, how many calls with, Valerie Jarrett, President Obama, Secretary Napolitano, Secretary Johnson, Sean Donovan at HUD. I mean, every cabinet secretary hosting some kind of call to try to help us as cities. We were not alone in this. And I have to say today, as I talk to a bunch of mayors, and another mayor does, and Carolyn does as well, but many of these cities today feel that they are on their own. They are just out there struggling, trying to make something happen, and that Washington is really kind of checked out. And that is a big difference between 2008 and 2020.
And so different from natural disasters and other precedents.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. You had states literally on eBay competing with each other, trying to buy personal protective equipment. You had cities scrambling on their own with their hospital systems, trying to figure all of this out. And so, I mean, there is still, 7 months later, there is still no known national strategy to deal with COVID-19. Now, if it was a hurricane, if it was a tsunami, if it was, a severe weather event, 25 inches of snow, or whatever the case may be, there are plans to deal with that. You're not alone, right? You ask everyone to stay at home so you can clear the streets, and then eventually, it melts, or you move it, or you do something with it, and you slowly bring your city back to life. There is nothing and no indication of when any of this will come to a conclusion. And so folks are just kind of hanging on and trying to ride this thing out, however far it goes. I'm not a Debbie Down. I'm actually a very optimistic person, right? So I'm not trying to be down in the dumps, but it is real when you have to make these decisions that mayors are facing every day.
And I wanted to invite Mayor Berke to talk about, it seems to me like local governments and states are also scrambling to develop guidelines in the absence of a clear path from the federal government. And sometimes those guidelines are conflicting. I know in our schools event that Kim referenced, we had a superintendent that said at one point it was 25 students per classroom, and then it was 16. And these have real effects, as you were talking about with the firefighter example too, that it's not easy to reconfigure your classrooms and to redeploy your school buses. So what has that been like for you as a local official?
Well, we've really seen federalism stretch to its limits here. Think about Chattanooga. So we have the federal government, we have the state government, we have the county government, because Chattanooga is the middle of that donut, and then we have city government. And unlike most things, for the most part, at least in our way of government, the county does much of the support, but is generally not the lead, except for on schools and health. Those are the places where the county is the lead. And so here we've had, over the last 6 months, the federal government, but I don't know that we could say the federal government is on this different page from somebody else, because there's different responses within the federal government as well. We have different comments. The state is on a different page from them. The county and the city have not been able to get together on what should be happening. And so people, when communication is one of the most important pieces of a public health response, people are hearing at least four different messages from people that they're supposed to trust, and things are staggered in just unbelievable ways. And so instead of really making it easy for people, we've made it extremely hard for them. At the same time, this takes place in a dynamic where, especially in a place, and Carolyn has a little bit of a different, political piece, but you have the red state, blue city piece going on in a state like Tennessee, where on a fundamental level, the state government has not been responsive to cities now for years on what they want. And this is another reason to say, well, you know what, you need to cut your services more. You need to scale back. And this has been really troubling to me. In the long run, I think there is a way to get back there, but a global pandemic is not conducive to 4 different responses. I'll leave you with this. Think about this. So Chattanooga is on the line with Georgia. And in fact, you know, there are suburbs of us that are right over the line. And so as we think about things now, we have a mask mandate in Hamilton County, but no rural county around us has one, and neither does anybody in northern Georgia. That affects our hospitals, that affects our workforce, that affects everything that we are doing. And so at some point, we have to say to ourselves, we're dealing with a global pandemic that does not respond to the little lines that we draw on a map. And we need a coordinated response instead of multiple layers deciding what they should do that's different from each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Tracy, if I could add to that, I mean, I've heard it in both the comments from both of the mayors. You know, recovery is going to depend on a great deal on confidence by the general public in the health system. And if we keep hearing 4 different viewpoints on is it safe, isn't it safe, what should you do? And the private sector in many cases is just as confused about what they can do and what they can't do. We're really setting ourselves so far back and getting the public confident again that they can go shop, that they can go dine, that they can get on airplanes and get back to some semblance of whatever normalcy is for us at this point. And if we can't get it together, then our recovery from this pandemic is going to be twice what it might normally be.
mm-hmm.
I mean, we have people in America debating whether or not you should wear a mask. I mean, we're 7 months into this. I'm confused. Like, what are you talking about, right? I mean, you don't have to be Madame Curie to figure out that, you know, that might be helpful to yourself or to someone else. So if we're at that fundamental of a level in this discussion, then how do you get to being in, you know, a slightly more crowded place, even outdoors? You know, what happens indoors? Go back to school, K-12, college, go into an office building. I mean, it just, you know, it all builds on each other. And as Carolyn said, I mean, it's about confidence,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and then, my goodness, you know, what will happen one day when there's quote unquote a vaccine?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, that next level of debate, who gets it, why, you know, I'm not taking it, I don't have to, you know, I mean, all of those, you know, kinds of issues. And so, I mean, we have some serious trust and credibility issues at a time of enormous crisis, beyond adding in, you know, the political mix.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to go to Q&A in a minute. So I just want to remind everyone to please submit your questions using the Q&A function. But I wanted to go back to Carolyn for a second, because if things didn't seem daunting enough already, you know, I'm a Californian and by birth, and I know that the state, you know, was dealing with a lot of big issues before this crisis: income inequality, homelessness, housing affordability. Those issues are not going away. If anything, they're getting worse in a public health emergency. Mayors have no choice but to try to lead through adversity. What kinds of leadership are you seeing, or what do you expect to see?
Well, I think whether I'm talking to California, talking about California city officials or ones from Tennessee or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there's just a pragmatism that happens at the local level. And yes, pre-pandemic, like many other states, cities and states across the country, we're dealing with challenges around housing affordability, homelessness, public safety. We always need more infrastructure investment, can never get enough of that. It keeps our community strong. And the impact of this pandemic has only exacerbated the underlying challenges that were already in place. And so, you know, we've got some choices at the local level. If we have to go to loan, certainly that's going to be difficult, but I don't know of a local official who's going to walk away from that. They're going to look at the resources they have, the assets they have in place, the private sector partnerships they can make. As Mayor Nutter mentioned, they're going to make choices about who delivers what service, and they're going to find ways to forge ahead. And if we're fortunate in the short term, the state and the federal government will follow our lead and make the investments that we need them to make in the local government. At the end of the day, the nation's GDP doesn't rebound and get strong again unless our cities do, because we're the economic engines of this country. We're the places where innovation happens. We're the places where over 80% of the residents in our country reside. And so recovery will start with us. And I continue to look forward to local leaders taking the lead on this in the coming months.
If I can just add to that, you know, cities right now, I can say this as a mayor, you know, we've got a global pandemic, we've got an economic crisis that's going on, we have a reckoning for 400 years of racial injustice. We have, to me, the psychological issues that come from all this turmoil together, and this is a huge challenge for all of us, and this is only going to be worth it if we can come back better and stronger. And there is a way for us to do this, but we have to have a partner in the federal government to make that happen. We just have to have a partner. And the main reason for that is because we only can, as Mayor Nutter said, he raised revenues, but we can't do that in a progressive way. When we raise revenues at the city level, that hurts the people who are already struggling the most. And we're going to have tremendous problems with inequality that have only been exacerbated. We have to have, at some point, revenue raised that helps with some of these problems that comes from the federal level, just because that's the only way we can deal with these problems. We cannot do that. We can't revenue our way out of this on the local level. Any additional revenue at some point, we've got to get the federal partnership.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I sometimes think of this as like an economic asteroid that has hit, you know, or you could use a weather analogy, but it's like a Cat 5 hurricane across the country for 2 years. And so local governments just are not positioned to raise revenues in a way that will help them solve this crisis, which leads to a question that's been on my mind that also has come up from the audience about balanced budget rules. I think a couple of you have mentioned that cities went into this with unprecedented budget reserves, but not enough to deal with this crisis. But balanced budget rules were adopted in response to a financial panic in the 19th century. It seems to me that there's no way that institutions that were appropriate in the 19th century are appropriate to the 21st century, which is not to say we should get rid of them for all my bond market friends who might be listening. But is there a way to modernize these institutions to respect the increasing volatility of revenues, the increasing volatility of economies, that just makes sense for the world that we're in these days?
You know, I mean, Tracy, that's, I think those measures were put into place. I mean, I wasn't around at that time, but I've read a little bit about it. You know, I think that takes us down a pretty steep and slippery slope. Mm-hmm. You know, in Philly, because of a previous financial crisis in the 80s into the 90s, we have a oversight entity, which I think is about to expire, but issued bonds back in the 90s and brought the city back literally from the brink of bankruptcy, required us to file 5-year plans. Our home rule charter requires a balanced budget. Unlike the federal government, you know, because we don't print money, right? We have to have a balanced budget. You can't spend more than you have. You know, that level of fiscal discipline, I think, is critically important. And if you start removing, tinkering with some of those rules, you will find cities literally going bankrupt, going out of business. And you know, certainly the rating agencies would go crazy. Your ability to borrow would go, interest rates would go through the roof. I mean, I think that is potentially the worst, you know, self-inflicted one. It is absolutely mortgaging the future to try to live in current times. So I agree with Mayor Berke, but this is about an infusion of significant dollars from an outside source for the sake of the country, and as Carolyn mentioned, for the sake of the national economy.
So let me add to that, that, you know, I think the balanced budget, at least for us, does a couple of things. Number one is it adds to local credibility, which is actually really, credibility and trust is in short supply right now in government. And it's great for us to have it. The second piece is that we don't control the Treasury. We don't control the Fed. And so the federal government, when it comes to debt, has some huge advantages on us and being unbalanced. They just have different resources available to them that we don't. And so it's more dangerous for us to do this than the federal government. I will say, it just is, and I say this all the time, it's like economics 101 right now, that we should try to get every dollar that we have out on the street that we can responsibly use. It is important for us to continue to do capital projects, to maybe borrow a little bit more now than we usually would to pay back, because as I said earlier, we're AAA bonded rated, rating city, so we can do some things that other people can't, and we've got to make sure that we're doing those. But I think that kind of figuring out what those are, and then still saying, hey, but for cities on this local level who don't have income taxation, who don't have progressive taxation, for us to really ramp up our spending and go out of balance is a different situation than for the federal government to do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a question also about sales taxes. And I guess this person's pointing out that the negative expectations are contrary to relatively flat retail and food service activity, at least through August. I guess I would just add to that, beyond restaurants or food services, there are many other things that are part of the retail sales tax base. And there are differences in the tax treatment of things like food to go versus food that's consumed in a restaurant. But I'm going to piggyback on that. If you could just talk about sort of expectations for sales taxes and also property taxes. I think it came up earlier that property taxes tend to be more stable. The last recession was a housing-centered recession, so it did affect property taxes. In this case, the link is not as direct. Nevertheless, if there are commercial buildings that are not seeing rents, they might be appealing their property taxes or their assessment levels. Maybe certain homeowners will do that as well if they're losing their job. So I just wonder if you all could sort of comment on specific revenue sources like that.
Yeah, I can at least start with that for Chattanooga. So just to give you an idea, Chattanooga is about $270 million operating budget, about $50 million of capital per year, and then $100 million for wastewater and some other dedicated funds. So end up being about $420 million or so. And things have been, because of the CARES Act and the $600 per week, that has been hugely beneficial to cities like ours. And so we haven't seen the massive drop, but we have huge issues in our entertainment industry and our hospitality industry. We have huge sectors of our city that are just really struggling, particularly local businesses, particularly businesses owned by people of color.
Yes.
And so when it comes to our sales tax, what we budgeted for this year on our operations dollars was an $8.5 million loss, which is just a little bit over 3%. Now, again, when you say relatively flat, 3% loss is relatively flat, but our costs continue to go up, and our healthcare and everything else costs more. And 3.5% may not, a little over 3% may not sound like a lot, but $8.5 million for us, is a very significant loss at a time where expectations and need among our constituents is growing by leaps and bounds. And again, our general, the general piece is that our sales tax, because again, we were a bit of an it city, has been growing in the neighborhood of 10%. So seeing a 4 or 5%, drop year to year, as opposed to a 10% increase, is a massive difference for us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned some expenditures that were going up because of COVID. And I know the federal government is reimbursing a lot of those costs right now through the CARES Act, but that funding goes away at the end of this year. And as I think Carolyn pointed out at the beginning, the worst year is going to be fiscal 21. And many people are projecting these effects will go into as far as fiscal 24. So it would be nice to have more help on the revenue shortfalls, as well as the increased need for spending that's directly related to the pandemic.
Before you end that, let me just say again on this red state, blue city thing, that those dollars went to the states, not to the cities.
Good
And so
point.
it's only the states
That's just my
where
point.
people want to reimburse cities that's actually happening.
Because you did not grow to 500,000 people overnight and qualify for the limited
Exactly.
direct funding.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to also talk about this sort of long run issue that we were talking about before, poverty. We have a couple of questions that came up. Mayor Nutter, just based on sort of what you know now about poverty or the way that the problem has changed and now is a lot in response to automation and other kind of secular trends, what are 3 things that you might have done differently as mayor, or I guess inviting all of you, what do you see as sort of poverty combating strategies that mayors are going to be looking at in the next several years, since it's really mayors that are on the front lines of this battle?
Well, you know, Trace, the first thing is, I mean, certainly coming into the mayor's office in 2008, I mean, and it was mentioned, I've been a city council member for a while, lifelong Philadelphian, et cetera. So, I mean, I've known that we have a poverty challenge and have had one for a long period of time. I think, in retrospect, I mean, I would have loved to have started our work on developing, which we eventually did, our anti-poverty plan. But quite honestly and bluntly, the recession got in the way. You can only do so many things at a time. When you're trying to literally save the city from, the brink of running out of money, it's just that much more difficult to work on such massive issues. But we did get to it, and we did develop a plan. It's still being utilized after my time. Shared Prosperity Philadelphia. The poverty rate actually has come down over the past few years. I mean, it went up during the recession and has slowly, kind of come back down. But this is really about education. It's about skills. It's about training. I mean, we have, hundreds of thousands of people not reading, at a level that they could, get work, computer literacy, I mean, a variety of things. And so, again, that recession, now this recession and a health crisis, how do we retrain Americans, again, for the jobs of the future, not the jobs that have gone away? And at the same time, Philadelphia is bolstered by heavy presence of education and medicine organizations, eds and meds, 37% of the jobs in Philadelphia, many of which do not require a 4-year bachelor's degree. And so training, certificates, and the like, I think will be helpful to leading Philadelphia and many other cities out of the current economic crisis. But yeah, I wish we had been able to start earlier, but we were literally trying to save the city from going broke.
Tracy, I would say in California, I don't know that nationwide we saw as much of this coming out of the Great Recession. Even as Mayor Nutter talked about it, there's an anti-poverty plan that sort of got put on hold, and then we focused on recovery. What I've seen here, a number of city officials and the governor, I'm actually injecting an equity component into the recovery plans. So we're going to try to capture that moment. It's obviously early, but since we were already a state dealing with tremendous inequities around the state, we know that people of color were disproportionately impacted by COVID. We have an opportunity in the recovery to do some correction on that.
Mayor Berke, is there anything you wanted to say on that?
I mean, I think that they're right. We've got to first, we got to make things safe. We're still not at a point where things are safe. And then we've got to focus on poverty and, to me, moving people to the middle class. We've seen that, erode over time in our entire country. And cities can be great innovators when it comes to this. There are lots of things that we can do and show the way. And then we've got to find ways in our country to take it to scale, which is very difficult. But you have to, again, back to this federalism point, we have to have participation at the state, federal, and local level to make these things happen. And for us at least, you know, we want those wages to go up. That's part of it. And so a multi-pronged attack is the only way that that's going to happen to raise the education level, the type of economic development you have, the attractiveness of your city. It takes a while, it's difficult, and it's got to be sustained over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I could, you know, the mayor said something much earlier, and I know we're running out of time, but I do really feel, you know, there are so many differences between 2008 and 2020, and you touched on it, he touched on it, and we haven't talked that much about it, but the civil unrest, the racial strife,
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 has forced out into the open, in addition to the murders of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and so many, Ahmaud Arbery, I mean, you know, so many names, so many people. And then you see that, you know, Black and brown people, again, disproportionately negatively affected by COVID-19. I mean, this is just, you know, brought to so much light and exposed out for everyone to really see, if you want to see. The challenges of Black people, brown people, people of color in the United States of America, and that when all of this happens at the same time, you know, these issues are not going away. We don't know an end date for COVID-19. We don't know an end date for fiscal distress. And we definitely don't know when are Americans going to decide, finally, that, you know, people are going to be treated equally. We're not going to have these differences. We're not going to, you know, be so glaring in the inequities. And so there's so much work to be done. But when Carolyn talks about trying to look at things from an equity lens, I think that is one of the driving components of what 2020 is about. And I'm just praying and hopeful that we don't lose sight of that as we make progress in some of these other areas. This is not a thing. It's not the moment. It is what's going on and what's happening in America. And we need to make sure that it remains front and center.
I think that's very well put. And I think, you know, we started off talking about small businesses and pressures on the service industry. And I think we shouldn't forget that the people that are employed in those businesses are often people of color, you know, immigrant families that are starting businesses. And cities have traditionally been wealth-building machines for those kinds of communities. And I am hopeful that cities can reclaim that role, maybe even do it better based on some of the reforms that we're seeing that some innovative mayors are trying. And that's a whole other panel that we could have some other time. So I need to wrap things up. I want to thank you all so much for being here. We're so privileged to have thought leaders of your caliber for this conversation. And I'd encourage everyone to you know, continue to engage with us at the Urban Institute and check out all the resources that we have about all of these issues at the state and local level, as well as the federal level. Thank you so much for being with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.